Today's video has been sponsored by Square Enix. Final Fantasy is a series that features incredible worlds, stories, and characters, but the thing that binds all those elements together is kicking monster butt. And in a franchise as diverse as this one, you have a lot of options on how to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, I am of course talking about the battle system, and these, in my opinion, are the top 5 Final Fantasy battle systems of all time. Obviously, my list is going to look way different than your list, as many of these systems are outright different genres, offering not much in the way of objective comparison, so try not to get into a fit when your fave isn't at the top. But before we get into the countdown, a word from today's sponsor, Square Enix. If you're a fan of the FF series, then Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia is a must-play. There are over 140 heroes and villains from the FF series here, and you can unlock all of them for the glorious price of free, with gacha mainly being used for weapons, and a pity system that ensures that you always eventually get what you're after. Fast-paced, snappy turn-based combat, multiplayer that allows you to team up with friends, music from FF games past and present, and an epic story that binds over 3 decades of Final Fantasy history in a way that will blow your mind. Truly, this game has it all. And now with Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia celebrating its 3rd anniversary, an already generous game becomes even more generous than usual. We're talking daily free multi-draw on the 3rd anniversary draw, free first multi-draws on select banners, and much more all the way until March 1st. So be sure to check out Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, available now on the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. Starting out with number 5, Enhanced Command Synergy Battle, Final Fantasy 13-2. Final Fantasy 13 is a divisive game to say the least, and its battle system, much like everything else in the game, sans the graphics which are gorgeous, is a bit rough around the edges. However, its sequel, Final Fantasy 13-2, goes a long way to alleviate most of the issues I had with the first game's combat. Command Synergy Battle, or CSB, is the most streamlined combat system among the mainline games. While spells like Firaga and Cure are regularly used across the Final Fantasy franchise, they also tend to have a handful of hyper-situational spells that most bosses are immune to and aren't worth using on regular mobs. The perfect combination to make something useless. Final Fantasy XIII's version of Command Synergy battles trimmed down the fat, ensuring that almost all of your abilities are useful in most fights. But no, it is the enhanced CSB system of Final Fantasy XIII-2 that makes the list. With standard CSB, essentially combat works by having your party members swap roles throughout battle depending on the situation. A bit of healing when health's low, buffs and debuffs to augment you and your opponent's stats, and plenty of damage by chaining elemental infused attacks and spells to fill your enemy's stagger gauge. Then let loose with more powerful abilities once that gauge is filled. Rinse and repeat. All of this is still true of Enhanced Command Synergy, but Final Fantasy XIII-2 has several quality of life changes that really bring the battle system into its own. I mean, for one, you can actively swap leaders mid-battle, something the original 13 was sorely missing. The game also had a Pokemon-like system allowing you to catch monsters and use them in battle, giving you way more options way more early on than the original Final Fantasy XIII ever did. All in all, it's a really solid battle system, and maybe someday soon we'll see the trilogy remastered. Number 4, Final Fantasy Type 0. I love Type 0, though I know the rest of the fanbase doesn't necessarily all share my same warm fuzzy feelings. Unlike previous Final Fantasy games, this isn't an intimate tale of heroes. Party members have numbers and code names instead of actual given names, and they die in just a few hits. Class 0 are nameless soldiers on the battlefield, and its battle system encapsulates this perfectly. With a cast of 14 playable characters and playable summons, you enter every mission with a small army. The game balances this large cast of characters with HP bars that drain far quicker than your average action RPG. The game takes inspiration from traditional FF games, with most characters' playstyles being inspired by classic jobs. Each party member can equip special abilities and magic in battle. The combat is very proto Final Fantasy 15, introducing what I like to call hold to combo, and with analog stick inputs to augment set combos. Combine that with character switching mid-battle, and it's easy to see where Final Fantasy 15 got some of its ideas from. Break sites and kill sites reward players for fast and precise timing, allowing you to land critical hits that are triggered just before or after an enemy attack. And these are extremely satisfying to land. Summons in Type 0 also require sacrificing one of your party members, yet again playing into the game's overall theme of the horrors of war and the people it takes away from us. Number 3, Traditional Active Time Battle System, or ATB. Now, admittedly, this kind of puts a good chunk of the series on here, as it has been the standard battle system for a while. In fact, it's the battle system that the series is known for. First introduced in Final Fantasy IV, this battle system has been iterated on time and time again, with mechanics in battle mostly remaining the same aside from a few nuances. Truly, it is in the meta of combat that you find the most striking differences between traditional ATB systems. Systems like Materia and Junctioning, unfortunately, are where these games stand apart in combat, even though it's technically outside of combat. Though for the most part, mechanically, ATB is ATB. You wait for the time gauge to build up and then you pick an attack. It's simple, straightforward, but it's an absolute classic and a staple of the series. If I had to pick my favorite iteration of this battle system, I would give the crown to the original FF7. While keeping everything that was great about previous iterations of the ATB system, Materia remained one of the most accessible and customizable systems in JRPGs. While we are unlikely to ever see the traditional system return to a mainline title, at least according to producer Yoshinori Kitase, I will still be an old man yelling at you Zoomers to play a real Final Fantasy. Number 2, Modernized ATB, Final Fantasy VII Remake. While it's absolutely no secret that I have my qualms with the storytelling in this game, when it comes to the battle system, I think Creative Business Unit 1 knocked it out of the park. Combat in Final Fantasy VII Remake is the most ideal adaptation of the traditional ATB system that we've seen yet. And I would go as far as to say that strictly in terms of combat, I enjoyed battles more than I ever did in the original. The game allows players to run freely around the battlefield slinging Cloud's Buster Sword, all while building up an ATB meter that you can use to unleash a much more powerful ability from your command menu. Adding on to this, at any time you can smoothly switch between characters freely, simply with the tap of a button. The result? All the fun of playing an action game, with all the strategy associated with command-driven systems. Furthermore, the battle system addressed one of the bigger problems with the original Final Fantasy VII. Each character, aside from their limit breaks, wasn't very distinguished apart from each other, and in part this was due to how the materia system works. Here in Remake, however, every character is exceptionally unique as the result of it being an action game. It does have some flaws though that need to be worked out. Bosses interrupting your limit breaks, and everything to do with aerial combat, good lord. But even with these blemishes, it's easily one of my favorite battle systems in the franchise. Number 1, Conditional Turn-Based, Final Fantasy X. For the first time since Final Fantasy III, the mainline series had returned to a system that used actual turns, and not one dictated by a time meter. At first glance, this may seem like a step back from the ATB system, but I disagree, as it introduced a bunch of new features that elevated it above the traditional system. Being able to switch characters mid-battle, and anytime that you wanted to rotate between your roster, was one of the biggest additions to the series, and something that blew fans' minds back in 2001. Previously, Final Fantasy games would typically limit you to roughly 3 or 4 characters in a single fight. Final Fantasy X made it so that you would routinely use all the characters in your arsenal, and on its more challenging boss fights, point, you could see yourself utilizing every character in your party within a single battle, with each character performing a very specific role and being tailored to handle specific enemy types. This meant that every single character was valuable and brought something unique to the table. And for the first time, turn order would be a visible window built into the game, with the character's stats being used to calculate how many turns they would receive. For example, characters that were fast, like Riku and Tidus, would receive multiple turns on top of each other, especially compared to someone who's more of a heavy hitter like Auron. I remember playing Final Fantasy X growing up, and there were some times I would encounter difficult boss fights, and I would literally sit the controller down for like 30 minutes and map out in my head how exactly I would defeat the boss. It is really Final Fantasy strategy at its best, and that's why, at least for me personally, Final Fantasy X offers the best combat in the franchise. But again, that's just for me. At the end of the day, I'm sure your list looks different than mine, so subscribe, click the bell icon, and let me know yours in the comments below. What are your top 5 Final Fantasy battle systems? I'll be excited to see which ones you pick. Shout out to patron Sig and the rest of the Ultima community.